Hi everyone, welcome to the last series of mini video lectures for History 1305 this semester. This week, our final week, we're going to be talking about what we've been building up to the entire class, which is the Civil War. And then at the end of our lecture today, we're going to briefly deal with Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the period that comes immediately after the Civil War, and it's all about trying to integrate the South back into the Union. A reason that this is an important subject, and I do want to talk about it a little bit, is because this is something that largely explains a lot of the failures when it comes to integrating African Americans into American society. What we're seeing here is, despite the fact that during Reconstruction, African Americans are beginning to get these really critical rights as citizens, there are a number of mechanisms put in place in the American South that will deny them these rights. And so we're going to talk about that just a little bit, but I am going to deal with it briefly because that is really a topic that gets covered in History 1306. So we're going to start right away dealing with the election of 1860 because this is truly the beginning of the Civil War. In 1860, we see the Democrats have sort of survived the geographic split we were talking about when we looked at slavery and sectionalism. The Whig Party had collapsed under that, and the party that had come in to replace the Whigs were the Republicans, who were running solely on an abolitionist platform. They were really looking to sort of end slavery across every inch of American soil. Now, in the election of 1860, the Democrats are completely divided. They're divided between North and South. And so the Southern Democrats they're putting this convention together in South Carolina, and the Southern Democrats are going to put forward a guy by the name of John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge is an incredibly hardcore pro-slavery advocate. So he's really representing that pro-slavery stance. But Northern Democrats couldn't get behind Breckinridge, and so they're going to support Stephen Douglas. We last saw him establishing the Kansas and Nebraska Act back in the 1850s. And so what we have here is at the convention, the Northern and Southern Democrats cannot agree on their candidate, so they put two Democrats forward. This is not a good way to win an election when you're going up against a unified party in the Republicans. To make matters even worse for the Democrats is former Southern Whigs and Know-Nothings, that anti-immigration party that we introduced in our last lecture. They're going to put forward another candidate, John Bell, and he's kind of a pro-slavery moderate. So what this is going to do is it's going to really fracture the votes that are behind slavery and the votes that are representative of the South. It's breaking them into three different groups. Because of this, the Republicans come out as the only unified party, and their candidate has the support of every Republican, and that is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is a senator, or at least a senatorial hopeful from Illinois, and he really puts himself on the national stage when he embarrasses Stephen Douglas in a number of debates meant to grab the Senate seat there. But ultimately, because the Democrats are so fractured and Lincoln and the Republicans are unified, it's going to be a pretty easy road to the White House for Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. So the South immediately is going to act when Lincoln is elected. When he wins this election, they are freaking out. They're fearing that this doesn't just mean the end of slavery in the American West, in the territories that America's been acquiring. They're concerned that this also is going to lead to the end of slavery in the American South. In December of 1860, before Lincoln's even taken office, he doesn't take office until January of 1861, South Carolina, believing that the election of a Republican president is an automatic assault on slavery, they are going to announce that they are seceding from the United States. They're breaking away. They see it as a violation of their rights as a state and as citizens of that state. And so ultimately what they're going to choose to do is say, we no longer want to be a part of the United States of America. If there's a Republican president, then we're not going to be a part of this union. And it's important to understand the process here. Again, Lincoln hasn't taken office. Lincoln on the campaign trail was talking about ending slavery in the West. He was talking about not allowing it to expand. He has not actually made an assault on Southern slavery in any way, shape, or form. But South Carolina is not going to wait around to see what he does. They don't wait until he pushes for any legislation, and they're just simply going to say, if Lincoln's president, we're out of here. And so very shortly after that, in the next 2 months, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas are all going to follow suit. Their representatives in Congress are all going to stand up and say, we are no longer a part of the Union, we are seceding as well, and they pack their bags and they leave. They go down to Montgomery, Alabama, which is the first capital of the Confederacy. So they draft down in Montgomery, these politicians are going to draft up a new constitution. It looks nearly identical to the Constitution of the United States, with the exception that it has explicit allowances for slavery. It makes clear that slavery is legal in these Confederate States of America. And that's the name that they are going to go by. So throughout the rest of the lecture, when I say the South, the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, we're talking about the secessionist states, the states in the South that have broken away and are no longer part of the United States. Those politicians are also going to elect a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, a Mississippian, to be the president of the Confederacy. So in the North, they're kind of taken aback by this entire process. They can't believe that all these southern states have now simply broken away. And there are moderates who are hoping that they can fix this fracture before it comes to warfare. One of them is John Crittenden, who is a senator from Kentucky. He is basically going to say, look, we need to be rational. We need to find a compromise. And in that process, he puts forward what we now call the Crittenden Compromise. This is happening in 1861, very early on. What the plan basically says is we need to go back to the Missouri Compromise line, that line, the imaginary line that runs across the United States at the 36th and 30th latitude and longitude. And basically what that's going to say is, he says, let's just extend that to the Pacific, and then we'll be good. Everyone will be happy, and we don't need to go to war over this. And so anything below that, slavery would be legal, and anything above it, slavery would be illegal. So neither Lincoln nor Jefferson Davis are going to accept this compromise. Neither side is willing to bend on this. There's two key issues going on here. Number one, Lincoln said, I have one promise to the American people. Slavery will not move westward at all. That is my promise. So if he takes this compromise, he's breaking his own promise to the American people, because this line would extend to the Pacific coast. On the flip side, this doesn't work for Jefferson Davis either, because Jefferson Davis knows the lands that he's getting are desert for the most part. They're lands where slavery is not going to be able to profitably expand, and it's not going to allow slavery to go to the parts of the country where slave labor could actually be feasible. So neither side accepts this compromise, and the discussions on it break down. So it's a failed compromise. Now, Davis, for his part, kind of believes that hopefully if we break away and we mind our own business, maybe the North will leave us alone. And Lincoln, on his end, is thinking, this is a bluff. This is the way that the South is trying to basically make big threats and get leverage in these kinds of talks over slavery. And so neither one of them at the outset necessarily see this as leading to an inevitable conflict that can't be resolved. But as time starts to drag on, it's looking more and more likely that armed conflict will be the only way they're going to be able to deal with this schism. And so Lincoln is finally going to put his foot down on the issue. And what Lincoln says is, okay, you've broken away, you've declared your independence, your secession from the United States, but everything that the federal government owns in southern lands, it still belongs to the federal government. He actually declares secession as unconstitutional, and he starts trying it in the courts. But more importantly, what he says is Any military forts that exist in the American South or in the West, they still belong to the United States of America. Any federally owned lands in these territories, it's still the property of the United States of America. And so he's basically saying these areas in the secessionist state, just because you broke away doesn't mean they belong to you. They still belong to the North or to the Union. Food and supplies start to run short in some of these military encampments in the South. In particular, the sort of hot button or the hot sort of jumping off point for the war is a fort in South Carolina known as Fort Sumter. The federal troops who are stationed there are running low on food and supplies, and Lincoln sends the governor of South Carolina a message. He says, I'm sending down federal ships, Union ships, and they're going to resupply the fort and the men who are staying there. And he's basically trying to say that's still our territory, that is still our fort and our property, and we are going to resupply it, whether or not you recognize the United States or not. But rather than waiting for this ship to arrive or allowing for these supplies to be dropped off, the Confederacy is going to essentially just start to attack the Union soldiers who are holed up in Fort Sumter. They start to siege Fort Sumter in early 1861. And this is largely seen as the beginning of the Civil War. General Beauregard is going to be leading the Confederate troops in their raid on that fort, and they will successfully take Fort Sumter from the Union. And so this is considered the first battle of the Civil War. Now, well in spirit, the American Civil War is definitely being fought over this contentious issue of slavery. Politically, the war is actually about the right of Southern states to break away or secede from the Union. You have to understand that Lincoln's rhetoric at the outset of this war is not, we're taking your slaves away, we're fighting this war over slavery. That's not how Lincoln is approaching this. And there's a couple of reasons why, and we'll get into those as this lecture goes on. But ultimately, what this is all about is, for Lincoln, it's about the fact that the South doesn't have a right to secede. He says that the war for the North is about maintaining the Union, not about the issue of slavery. In response to the attack on Fort Lincoln, after the Confederacy raises its flag above the fort and claims it as their own, Lincoln and the Union see this as an attack on the United States. And in response, Lincoln will declare the Lower South to be in a state of insurrection. And ultimately, he will call for 75,000 Northerners to enlist in the Union Army. So, at the outset of the war, this does not look like it's going to be much of a war at all. It looks like it's going to go by really quickly, and that's going to be the end of it. If you were a betting person, if you were looking at this war on paper, the South has no chance. The North has an incredible advantage over them. But the attitude is clear that basically when you start to look at Northern newspapers, Northern journalists, when they're talking about this, they're saying, look, the Union is going to win decisively. It's going to be over quickly. Jefferson Davis and all of the people who have been in this sort of state of insurrection, they're all going to be swinging from the battlements in Washington by July. And so they don't see this war as lasting them more than a few months. Now, as we know, this is going to drag on for a number of years. But on paper, the North looks poised to absolutely devastate the South. If you're following through the slideshow with me, you'll see that I've given you a table there that sort of compares the advantages that the North has over the South. And when we look at these advantages, they pretty much hold the key to winning this war in every decisive area that you would need in a conflict or an armed battle here. The Union population is more than double that of the Confederacy. There's simply way more people in the North to begin with. The Union also has a massive advantage in terms of manufacturing. They manufacture the vast majority of the weapons in the United States. But it's not just weapons. They're also able to manufacture non-military supplies as well. They can make clothing and boots, the things that your troops need to sort of stay dressed and well insulated on the battlefield. They are producing more medicine. When you look at it, you see that basically in the Union, they're producing 97% of the weapons and ammunition in the United States. Now, obviously, in a war, this is going to give you a huge advantage. When we talk about railroad mileage, the North is able to quickly move their supplies to the battlefront. They have over 22,000 miles of railway, whereas the South only has 9,000. And that 9,000 is mainly meant to move farm-produced or plantation-produced products out to the coast. When we look at banking capital, you need a lot of money to win a war. The Union holds about $330 million in terms of banking capital. When you compare that to the U.S. South, they only have about $27 million. And so overall, the North just holds this massive advantage. Ideologically, there's an advantage for the North too. And what they're going to be able to do is they're going to say, look, for part of the people in the North, they don't care about slavery. Slavery doesn't matter to them. It's not an important issue. They're not willing to go and die for it anyway. And so for those people, the North can say, this war is not about slavery. This is about the fact that they illegally seceded from the United States and they are breaking our beloved Union apart. And so they have a sort of two-pronged attack of getting men to enlist in the North. If you're an abolitionist, then this is a war that is being fought over this issue of slavery. If you're not an abolitionist and you don't care about slavery, then you should be fighting for your patriotic duty. You should be fighting to hold the United States together. And so that's a major advantage that the North is going to be able to have when they go into this conflict. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about in this mini lecture video is the Southern response to this war. The South doesn't have all this material advantage. They don't have the weapons. They don't have a well-established army. They are going to play on a different type of rhetoric to get their people involved in the war. And mostly what they're going to do is they're going to go back to the American Revolution. They're going to start to cast their men as the new patriots of the Confederacy. What they're saying is that their rights are being trampled upon by an oppressive federal government. They're going to be able to start telling people that, look, this is the North coming in and attacking you in your homes. This is the federal government trying to take your rights away. And so you need to stand up and do your patriotic duty to ensure your inalienable rights. Now, we're talking about a demographic in the South where the vast majority of Southern whites do not own slaves. This is not a widespread practice when you look at the overall population. In fact, a very small proportion of the South is directly invested in slavery. So the question becomes, how do we get the poor, non-slave owning whites involved in this war? How do we get them to lay their lives on the line for the Confederacy and for the issue of slavery from which they don't profit? And the answer to that is a lot of rhetoric surrounding Abraham Lincoln. Essentially what the South is going to say is that Lincoln and these radical Republican people up north, they don't just want to end slavery in the South. They want to make a slave out of you. They want to basically enslave you to African Americans. And that is the rhetoric that's going around the South. They're saying Abraham Lincoln is a tyrant. He doesn't respect states' rights or inalienable rights. And so this is how they're going to get the poorer segments of Southern society to throw their support behind the Confederacy and behind the war effort. And so in addition to that, there's a couple other key strategic advantages that the South has. First, they are the ones who will be taking a defensive posture throughout this war. And it is far easier to get people on your side, fighting for your war effort, if the northern armies and the Union armies are coming into the South and attacking you in your home state. Now it's easy to say, we need to defend our home. We're under assault. And it's also, in terms of military outlook, it's always far easier to fight on the defensive than it is to mount a successful offensive. And so that's one of the advantages they're going to have. And then the thing I've sort of been tiptoeing around, and perhaps the biggest advantage, as historians tend to see it, for the South in the Civil War is that of military leadership. The North does not have good military leadership. They have very poor military leadership. Their officers, their generals, they're all high-ranking officials, but very few of them have seen actual combat. Very few of them have led troops into war. This is not true of the South. The Southern generals, people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, General Beauregard, these guys are all guys who have seen active conflict with Native Americans. They have seen active conflict in the Mexican-American War. They have actually led troops into battle, and they really know what they're doing. The Northern leadership is more accustomed to sitting in offices up in the North, occasionally parading in fancy uniforms, and going to high society parties. They're people who were appointed basically because of their social status. They don't know anything about actual combat and warfare. And so this is going to give the South a key advantage when actual conflict starts to really break out and we start looking at the early campaigns of the war. That's it for this mini lecture video. We'll be picking it up immediately after this and starting to look at some of the early conflicts.